In the year Mutmitam Tam Euteun, to the great powers of Europe, Africa was often seen as a vast, unknown puzzle, a dark continent, as they called it, waiting to be discovered, mapped, and claimed. Maps of the time showed huge, blank spaces labeled simply unexplored. This single word painted a picture of emptiness, a void ready to be filled by European ambition. But this picture was a profound illusion, a convenient fiction. Pull back the curtain of this European perspective, and the reality of the continent comes into focus, vibrant and complex. This was not an empty land. It was a continent of empires, kingdoms, and sophisticated societies. In the south, the Zulu kingdom, a disciplined military power, held vast territories. In West Africa, the Ashanti Empire thrived, renowned for its intricate gold work and powerful administration. To the east, the Ethiopian Empire, an ancient Christian kingdom with a history stretching back millennia, stood proud and independent. And these were just a few. From the Sokoto Caliphate in the west to the Kingdom of Buganda in the east, Africa was a mosaic of states. And connecting them all, a web of ancient and bustling trade routes. Caravans of camels traversed the Sahara, carrying salt, gold, and textiles, linking West Africa with the Mediterranean world. Along the Swahili coast, dhows sailed the Indian Ocean, their holds filled with ivory, spices, and precious metals, part of a global trade network that had existed for centuries. These routes weren't just for goods, they were conduits of ideas, religion, and culture. Great centers of learning like Timbuktu had flourished for centuries, housing vast libraries and universities. So, when European leaders gathered to draw lines on a map, they were not carving up an empty wilderness. They were dismantling a continent teeming with history, culture, and power. The stage was being set for a collision of worlds, one driven by a profound and deliberate misunderstanding. In the late 19th century, a new kind of gold rush was brewing. But this wasn't for gold. It was for an entire continent. At the heart of this storm stood one man, a king with an insatiable appetite for power and wealth. King Leopold, an older man with a prominent long white beard, wearing a lavish metal-adorned military uniform, of the small nation of Belgium, looked upon a map of Africa. While other European powers saw impenetrable jungles, he saw a personal empire. He masked his ambition with a clever disguise, philanthropy. He formed the International African Association, a supposed humanitarian organization, dedicated to civilizing the heart of Africa. Banners with noble symbols were unfurled. But behind this facade, his true goal was the immense wealth of the Congo Basin. Imagine a territory 75 times the size of his own country, brimming with rubber and ivory. His agents, led by the explorer Stanley, moved through the Congo, not with aid, but with treaties. Local chiefs, unaware of the legal language, signed away their lands for trinkets and cloth. These documents, marked with simple X's, became Leopold's deeds of ownership. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, he masterfully played the great powers against each other. He presented his Congo Free State not as a Belgian colony, but as a free trade zone for all, a buffer against his rivals. The ploy worked. The world leaders, blinded by their own rivalries, handed him the keys to a kingdom. The map of Central Africa was redrawn. A vast area, once a mosaic of hundreds of cultures, was now shaded in a single color, labeled Congo Free State. It was his personal property. This single act of colossal greed lit a fire. A frantic panic erupted as other nations scrambled to claim their own piece of Africa before it was too late. The great carve-up had begun. By the late 19th century, Europe's powers were in a frenzy. A mad dash, a scramble for Africa, was on. Explorers and missionaries had mapped the interior, revealing vast resources. Suddenly, Every kingdom and empire wanted a piece. The continent was a prize, but the competition was getting dangerous. King Leopold II, long beard, regal Belgian uniform, of Belgium, had already claimed the Congo as his personal property, a brutal and shocking move. Tensions flared between Britain, France, Germany, and Portugal. War seemed possible. To prevent this, the German Chancellor Bismarck, prominent white walrus mustache, formal diplomatic attire, called a meeting. In 1884, representatives from 14 nations gathered in Berlin. No African leaders were invited. Their goal was simple: to create rules for the colonial conquest of Africa. They weren't there to protect Africans, but to protect their own interests from each other. The conference laid out the principle of effectivity. To claim a territory, a European power had to actually occupy it, build infrastructure, and fly their flag. It was a gentleman's agreement for theft. A giant, detailed map of Africa was laid on a grand table. One by one, diplomats with glowing rulers drew straight lines across jungles, rivers, and mountains. They ignored thousands of years of existing cultures, ethnic groups, and kingdoms. These lines, drawn in a cold Berlin winter, would become the borders of modern African nations. They sealed the fate of millions, setting the stage for decades of exploitation, conflict, and colonial rule. The Berlin Conference didn't start the scramble, but it legitimized it, turning a chaotic land grab into an orderly, European-approved division of an entire continent. The story of the late 19th century scramble for Africa is not just one of politics, but of a staggering technological gap. On one side of the ledger, a revolution in steel and steam. On the other, traditions of warfare centuries old. Let's visualize this imbalance. First, firepower. The Europeans brought the Maxim gun, a single crank-operated machine that could fire 600 rounds a minute, a terrifying wall of lead. Against this, African armies often fielded spears, shields, and outdated muskets, brave but hopelessly outmatched. Then there was mobility. European iron-hulled steamships, immune to disease-carrying insects, churned up rivers that were once impassable barriers. They moved troops and supplies deep into the continent's heart with shocking speed. The primary counter was the dugout canoe, powered by muscle against relentless currents. This technological chasm, fast-firing guns against spears, steam power against paddles, was not just an advantage. It was the mechanism of conquest itself, turning ambition into swift, brutal reality. In the late 19th century, a bold and audacious vision gripped the British Empire. It was a dream painted in imperial red on the map of a continent, the Cape to Cairo Railway. This was more than just tracks and steel. It was a grand strategy to link Britain's colonial possessions from the Mediterranean shores of Egypt all the way down to the resource-rich lands of South Africa. The plan was championed by the mining magnate and politician Rhodes. For him, this railway was the steel spine of a contiguous British dominion, a tool for trade, military control, and settlement across Africa. Imagine a single unbroken line, a ribbon of British influence stretching over 5,000 miles. The vision was powerful, but the reality was fraught with immense challenges. A massive German territory, German East Africa, stood squarely in the path, a formidable obstacle blocking the route. The rugged, unforgiving terrain itself presented a monumental engineering nightmare. Furthermore, fierce resistance from local peoples and the costly Boer Wars in the south drained resources and political will. The project advanced in disjointed sections, with lines being built in Egypt, Sudan, and from the Cape northward. But the crucial central link, the part that would connect it all, remained a stubborn gap on the map. After the First World War, Britain gained control of the German colony, renaming it Tanganyika. For a moment, the dream seemed possible again. But by then, the world had changed. The colossal expense, the rise of air travel, and growing anti-colonial sentiment made the Grand Railway seem like a relic of a bygone era. The Cape to Cairo Railway was never completed. It remains one of history's great what-ifs, a phantom line on the map, a testament to the sheer scale of imperial ambition and the complex realities that ultimately brought it to a halt. In the late 19th century, West Africa was a vibrant tapestry of powerful empires, ancient kingdoms, and independent communities. From the vast Sahel to the lush coast, societies thrived on complex networks of trade and tradition. But a storm was gathering across the sea. The scramble for Africa had begun, and for France, the prize was a colossal swathe of this land. Their ambition was staggering, to link their possessions from the Senegal River to the Niger and all the way to the Mediterranean. It began with coastal forts and trading posts, small blue dots on a vast map. But these dots would not remain small. Through a relentless combination of military force, unequal treaties, and the driving ambition of colonial officers, the expansion began. Columns of featureless French soldiers and their African tirailleur allies marched inland. Rivers became highways for gunboats. The Maxim gun, a terrifying new weapon, silenced resistance with brutal efficiency. One by one, local rulers were forced to submit. Ancient borders drawn by centuries of culture were erased and redrawn with European ink on new documents. Railways, the iron sinews of empire, snaked across the landscape, not to connect African peoples, but to extract resources back to the coast. From Mauritania's deserts to the forests of Ivory Coast, the blue on the map swelled, swallowing territory at a breathtaking pace. By the early 20th century, an area 8 times the size of France itself was consolidated into a single entity, French West Africa, a vast, unified colonial empire built in just a few decades, fundamentally and forever altering the destiny of millions. The story of empire is often told as a one-sided conquest, a relentless tide sweeping over passive lands. But this is a fiction. Beneath the surface of every colonial map, a fire of resistance burned. It was a struggle fought on countless fronts by millions who refused to surrender their world. In the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, guerrilla fighters melted into the shadows, striking at columns of invaders. Across the African plains, spiritual leaders rallied their people, promising divine protection against foreign bullets. In the Americas, indigenous nations waged centuries-long wars to defend their ancestral lands. But in 1896, in the highlands of Ethiopia, this simmering resistance erupted into a stunning, world-changing victory. The Italian army, armed with modern rifles and artillery, marched confidently into the heart of an ancient kingdom. They expected a swift and easy triumph. They did not expect Emperor Menelik II, regal, bearded, wearing a traditional Ethiopian crown, a shrewd strategist who had spent years acquiring modern weapons of his own. And they certainly did not expect the unified fury of a nation defending its independence. At the Battle of Adwa, over 100,000 Ethiopian soldiers, from farmers to noblemen, descended upon the invaders. The European officers, blinded by arrogance, had fatally underestimated their foe. The result was not a battle, it was a rout. A decisive, shocking defeat for a modern European power at the hands of an African army. The victory at Adwa echoed across the globe. It shattered the myth of European invincibility and became a beacon of hope for colonized peoples everywhere, proving that the will of a free people could and would overcome the might of an empire. But the lines drawn on a map in Berlin were more than just new borders. They were the blueprints for a colossal economic engine, an engine designed with a single purpose: to extract. For decades that followed, the immense wealth of an entire continent was methodically siphoned away to Europe. Imagine it as a vast network of arteries, all flowing in one direction. First, the precious rubber bled from the Congo's vines under the most brutal conditions imaginable. Then came the glittering diamonds, pulled from the deep mines of the south, and the lustrous gold, unearthed in the west. Vast plantations of cotton and cocoa, destined only for European factories, and ivory, harvested at a tragic, irreversible cost. This was no partnership in trade, it was a one-way conveyor belt to the sea. Infrastructure, like railways, was laid not to connect African peoples, but to create efficient funnels from the interior straight to the coastal ports. There, steamships waited, ready to carry the bounty north. The numbers themselves tell a staggering story. Animated charts reveal a dramatic vertical spike in raw material exports from Africa, while the return flow of industrial investment or finished goods remains almost flat. As European capitals, London, Paris, Brussels, grew ever richer, their industries booming on these resources, local African economies were systematically dismantled. Once self-sufficient communities found themselves forced into cash crop monocultures or wage labor for colonial masters. The true price of partition wasn't just paid in lost land or sovereignty. It was an economic debt written in the very soil and minerals of Africa, an imbalance whose echoes still shape the world we live in today. The year is 18,084. In a grand hall in Berlin, the great powers of Europe gather. But they are not there to discuss peace or trade within their own lands. Their eyes are fixed on a continent rich in resources and history, Africa. With rulers and pens, they began to carve it up. This was the infamous Scramble for Africa. Straight lines, drawn with geopolitical ambition, sliced across the continent. They paid no mind to the ancient kingdoms, the intricate cultures, or the ethnic groups who lived there. Imagine a single, unified community suddenly split in two by an invisible wall. Now imagine two rival groups with generations of conflict forced to share a new nation. This was the reality created on paper, thousands of miles away. Fast forward to the mid-20th century. A wave of independence sweeps across Africa. New flags are raised and new hopes are born. But a difficult choice had to be made. To redraw the map would risk endless wars with their new neighbors. So, for the sake of stability, most nations kept the colonial borders they inherited. They inherited the lines, and with them, the problems. These artificial boundaries became flashpoints for conflict. Disputes over resources straddling a border, civil wars fueled by ethnic tensions locked within a single state. Look closely at the modern map of Africa today. As it fades in over the colonial blueprint, you can see it. The unnaturally straight lines remain. They are not just lines on a map. They are the deep, lasting scars of history.